first time around as a creative person, I ran a jewellery business. I designed for people like Paul Smith and Margaret Howell. I sold to Barney's New York. I had clients like Sting and the Rolling Stones and all sorts. Good business, but it was the 80s and we got very mucked up with interest rates and banking and didn't run the business well. Ended up pretty much going bankrupt. So I became a teacher. I'd always taught. I've taught in various art colleges all the time, and I enjoy teaching. And this time I was teaching in a sixth form college, and I was teaching art history, but also some painting and drawing. And I discovered after a while, unless you knew how to paint, you couldn't teach painting. So I started to paint, and I did a lot of portraits, because that's always what I'd liked anyway. And I just really discovered oil paint, fell in love completely with oil paint. So in order to teach the students, I started painting. That was about 2008, so that's really where I started painting. As a painter, I'm completely self-taught. Recently I've done a course, one of those academic painting courses, which I didn't find massively useful. In fact, a lot of people have asked me recently, and people have started asking for tutorials, and students phone up, and I get all these people saying, could I teach them how I do it, what my technique is, how I've worked. And I've tried to help people as much as I can, but I find the most useful thing is what I did, which is to go and stand in front of paintings for hours on end. Rembrandt was my first. I stood in front of Margarita de Grille for hours, working out, where the paint is thick and rough, where the paint is thin and transparent, where he's put it on with a palette knife, where he's scraped it off again, where he's left the background to show through. Same with Rubens. The painting of Samson Delilah in the National Gallery, you can see underpainting, which kind of glows from the colour that he's used. So you work out what colour he's used underneath, and then the thick painting on top. So standing in front of paintings for hours, and then trying to do it. The traditional technique of copying the masters. There's very little painting taught in art colleges now. So if you're going to learn, practice, look all the time. You can't get it. I think it's impossible at the moment for me to not use photographs, because of the people I'm painting are successful and busy, and I can't get the time with them that I'd like to spend. The painting I did for the BP last year of Jean, I painted largely from life. And it's a different experience. And I think as long as you're aware that it is a different process, because there are points where I find having the model there actually disruptive. They largely want to talk, and to begin with, I would like to work with a model who isn't a statue. So I like them to talk. But then there's later on points where they need to be completely still. And then there are some very technical things where a photograph is actually more useful, where you need to look at how a bone is pushing through the skin, or the light is reflecting off the eye. So I'll try and work with a process that mixes both photography and sittings. So at the moment I'm using both in a kind of hopefully quite fluid way. So my painting, as opposed to something like a photorealist painting, I think is very much, you should be aware of I don't want it to be too blatant, but I want the fact that it's a long process and a difficult process, a process of painting where I scrape away layers and make more mistakes than I make correct marks. All of that should be there in the painting, so you see the kind of history of what's happening. I think that makes it kind of more human in a way. And there's always a point where the paint reaches this quality. I had Taishan Schierenberg talking about it recently, and I know Freud talked about where paint becomes like flesh. It achieves a kind of translucence, but a physicality that is like flesh. I also like that thing that you can get where the edge of something dissolves into another edge and breaks down, a kind of modern version of sfumato, the Leonardo's thing of the blurring of the edges, but as vision doesn't take in photorealistically every corner of detail, but focuses on certain points and draws you into those. Our brain is hardwired to look at eyes, to look at other parts, and so in a sense my paintings sort of dissolve away from those points of focus. But then I quite like to throw in random little details. Some of the earlier paintings I did, like of rooms and things, I'd like to focus on aspects of the room, a lamp or angle poised lamp, a chair or something, as if those elements of the painting were important as well. But at the moment I'm kind of, those things are leaving and it's becoming more to do with the colourful abstract qualities of paint and this moment where the portrait element seems to have some kind of life, you know, like that kind of paint becoming like skin, as if you're not entirely, you know it's paint, but it also has a kind of, hopefully quite a live quality. So the painting I did of Jean Woods for the BP Portrait Award 2014, I used that process where we did about 6 sittings over a month or two. And then Jean, who was very professional, you know, she's a model now, became a model in her 70s, but she was very good at sitting very still, at not talking, at concentrating, at focusing on a point. But all the same, I still felt that I wanted those moments of being completely alone with the painting as well. And actually, that on a photograph is very good, where I could paint long into the night, I could get cross, I could play music, I could become completely lost in the process. And for that, a photograph is actually better. But then there are times where you need to understand a person, because ultimately it's a, you know, I know this is a well-said thing, but it's a document, a record of a relationship, and therefore you have to be there with the person. Yeah, the painting I did for the BP was different than what I've been doing previously, partly because I think I've been searching for a subject. So I painted roads in sort of motorways and as a kind of a reflection of an urban landscape or a landscape that we all experience. I kind of had this idea that pastoral landscapes really were not relevant to most people, so I painted roads. Somehow I found it unsatisfying. I brought more abstract elements into those paintings, but wasn't satisfied. Then I went back to the people that I've been looking at in order to understand how to paint, Rembrandt, Van Dyck, and they're portrait painters primarily. And I had to go at that, and that was my subject. The painting of Jean that I did then for the BP began to fuse those things, and is, in a sense, was very much a transitional painting. My painting has gone in a different direction since, and I'm really... I think what it did for me, that degree of success, is gave me the confidence to really think, okay, I know what I want to achieve now, much more. We, in fact, live in a tiny little village now. When I was a jewellery designer, my studio was in Clerkenwell, and I was doing London Fashion Week, I was doing Paris Fashion Week. We were very kind of connected to the London scene. When that all went sour, we wanted something very different. So we moved to this very rural, sweet little village. And right now, my wife and I are talking all the time, should we move back to London? As much as anything, not because I think I've become anything on the art scene or whatever, but that sense of not being part of a kind of bigger, more exciting environment is really beginning to sort of niggle. It's easy to come up. I come up more often, you know, I spend more time in the West End now than I probably did when I lived here. I do more, I see more exhibitions, you know, I come up on that kind of tourist ticket and come up to do something specific. But somehow I don't feel connected. I don't think you have to be anymore, but it's personal. And at the moment I feel like I want to be back up here. I think there's a split between the kind of high-end intellectual art world and a kind of, it's not commercial art world, but a world where artists who are becoming more independent and kind of like a traditional maker, almost like on that craft sense, where artists want to have more control. The push, you know, the local sort of gallery for us for doing that kind of stuff would be the Arnold Feeney in Bristol, but like all the Tates and things. You know, the sort of low-grade video, bad quality TV sets piled up high, multiple things going on. I don't know. When I was teaching and I take my students regularly to those things, they were always very disengaged. And I always felt like the theory would be that they'd be very engaged because it seemed to be the kind of technology they were moving into, but they were moving into and through it and past it so quickly. And people of my generation, it's already too much for us. Because I think I've come to the art world late. My training was, like I say, was in fact in architectural metal design, so I was much more down the that architectural world. So I've never really been a part of the art college to becoming an artist route. So I see myself outside of that at the moment, and the funding for what I'm doing and the way that I'm now, I'm working full time as an artist now through portrait commissions. There seems to be a sort of real passion for portraits, painted portraits again. But a lot of artists that I know are also making their living through small commissions, through a private route, through direct contact with the client, often mediated by a gallery, but not through the sort of big public galleries at all. So artists are finding their own ways to fund themselves through art, not through institutions. And that actually, I think, for the people that I know, which is very much the sort of Bristol arts in the Bath art scene, they're making a good living, but also being less inhibited. I wouldn't say I'd reject the sort of large institutions and what their role is. I think they're really important, but whether they are on the, I don't think I'm in a position to say whether they've got their finger correctly on the pulse. But portraiture's always been considered a kind of lesser art, back to the academic hierarchies. It's never been, it's what jobbing artists do, and I think there's a kind of snobbery still about what I'm doing, which I think is mistaken, but I think it's still there. Doesn't mean to say it would stop me doing it at all. I think it's interesting that painting seems to be having some form of revival at the moment against all the kind of digital and other art forms. The difficulty, I think, is if you try to find some sort of hierarchy and say that one art form is better than the other, then you go down lots of blind alleys in trying to justify one art form over another. The only thing that matters is that the artist saying something that is meaningful or useful. But the other interesting question, therefore, though, is why does painting seem to have a kind of immediacy, even though it's a very laboured process very often, that I think does attract people and draw people in.